really excited.
Steve, should we start? Okay, call to order. Approval for minutes for the May 28th meeting. A motion? Second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
I have a question though.
Bill?
The minutes say that D moved to direct the staff to compose a letter to the congressional delegation encouraging their support and requesting the Corps put into the dredging. My only question is, Steve, did a letter get written?
Sorry.
It's on.
Okay.
The
Say
last
that.
meeting, D asked for somebody to compose a letter to the congressional delegation pertinent to the Corps' money with dredging.
Yes.
Curious first if it happened.
So an update on that is the next day or the next week, the next following Tuesday after we met, there was a management update meeting with the city council, and Alderman Grip provided an update back to the council on that full discussion, including the letter in which the case the mayor was interested in signing a letter to the congressional delegation, and I've provided that letter to him, and I have not heard confirmation yet if it's gone out, but he has the draft in order to sign it and send it out.
Good, thank you.
And I reviewed it. Made some changes.
Yes. And the council, just real briefly, the council at that discussion was very interested in supporting not only the commission, but of course, Lindsay Park Yacht Club in those efforts.
Approval for disbursements. Anybody have any questions? D? Discussion?
I do want to point something out while you're thumbing through. I have communicated to each of the tenants about the forgiveness of rent, depending upon the varied time periods and all of that. And so they generally, I wanted to respond with all of them. We're extremely grateful to the commission for doing so. I also communicated that if anyone was arrears, and we have a few, as you can see, that we needed to pay in full by the end of the fiscal year, which is actually June 30 for us. And so I've communicated that. I sort of stipulated that is part of the forgiveness piece, so that because it really hurts our budget if we let that go too far past. Now, if we do, I've also communicated there are a couple of our tenants who are up for renewal in a few more months, and as a general rule, if we're not paid in full by the time that renewal is being sought, I'm not real keen on providing you with a draft renewal agreement, okay? So I have to have some stops along the way. I'm not trying to be, too harsh, but we have to have some stoppages, otherwise we can easily get 6 and 8 and 10 months behind. Now, that all being said, I think we all know the difficult, challenging several months have been for many of our tenants. And so I believe they're working on it, and we're working with them. And I just kind of wanted to let you all know as it relates to the aging of accounts receivables. Dee?
My question is this everyone that was billed the beginning of June? Because I see some people who just have a June bill. It says bill date June.
So they're billed.
Is that for the year,
The
or
way
what?
finance sends these, the way the box reads, if you will, is the bill, it's a month, you pay a month prior to the month for which it's due. So they're sent out, say, for example, June 3rd. It's due by June 30th, but it's for July rent. So the idea is that you're paying the month before the month starts that you owe, so that we're being paid a month ahead, actually.
Right. So there are a couple of them that's all they're on. That's all is. So I was wondering if this was just your receivable list or.
It is.
Okay.
It's
I'm
not.
done.
It's
Right,
an
that's
aging of
exactly what I
accounts
wanted.
Receivables. It's not a.
And so some of them
delinquent list.
haven't really aged. They just happen
Correct.
to be on the list with
Different-
everyone else.
Different points of aging. Yes.
Just wondering.
If you look at Nostalgia Farm,
You need. Yeah, they're. I think about 4 months behind. That's one of them that I'm talking about.
That's one of the ones that it's up for renewal in a couple months.
Correct.
So then are the months in the interim, were those ones that were forgiven then? And so then it's actually that they haven't paid since late last year? Is that accurate? Okay.
revenue billing tables, number 9, that's really Skyline.
Tell me again.
It's Driftwood on, it shows Driftwood on there, but it's really the Skyline. Number 9.
Don't I have buds? Are you
Hey,
talking
it's
about?
slash.
I did a slash because it was both in this fiscal year.
And then when I go over to, if I tried to color the ones that we forgave, they're all shown there. Have you got them all? That's what you tried to get them all anyway.
They're shown, but the months should be zeroed out. I thought that table should be updated for you. No? Am I misunderstanding what you're asking?
You answered the question.
Okay. Yeah, because the total amount has come down substantially if you compare last month's to this month's, obviously. But as I've said, the next fiscal year, which, next month's meeting, you'll see the new fiscal year, and you're going to see a much better financial position, which, by the way, I could save this for the staff meeting, but since we're talking about tenants, the staff update, but since we're talking about tenants, 2 additional tenants, Bud Skyline Riverview just opened in early June. That's good, right? Because we get a percentage of their gross sales. And so having them open now is very good, and they've been very busy. It's been positive. They've been positively received. And then I just touched base with Taste of Ethiopia. They're at the Package Express building, and they are planning a soft opening, but to open next week. They're just waiting some final inspections. So that's very good news.
Kelly?
So I assume some of these will be folks who will be applying for some of the grant money, I would think, that was just announced between the Chamber and DDP. And so the timing on those grants are that the applications are due July 3rd, and they expect to disperse by July 31st, I believe. So do we have an expectation that some of these people might be in that category? And is there a way for us to maybe get communication from some of them to know if that would be what they might be waiting on?
Yeah, I have encouraged them each to apply. I didn't hear until very recently the criteria, very recently. And so I wasn't too sure that when you compare water inundation of some businesses in the community with closing but not taking on water, content ruining, that sort of thing, how those are going to be dispersed.
One of them is specifically for, just being closed, not being able to be open.
I
So,
saw that just this morning.
yeah. So I guess my question, maybe my comment is just, open communication with them to find out, which of them might be applying for those grants, and see if that is something just for us to be aware of in terms of the timing of some of it. If the money's not dispersed until the 31st, obviously that's a timing challenge, I know.
Yeah. No, I definitely will follow up.
Anyone else? Hearing no one else, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor of accepting the disbursements, say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Disbursements.
Well, first things first, I want to introduce the item in your packet and introduce Tim Stecker, who's with IH Mississippi Valley Credit Union. That's right.
That's correct. Thank you.
And he can answer some specific questions if you should have any. But basically, this is a matter last dealt with in 2011. So prior, for some of you, I want to give a little background. You heard last month from Dan Darlin with the Lindsay Park Yacht Club about the immediate needs for some dredging. And in order to accomplish that, they needed to secure a loan. And we last provided our assistance with that loan documentation paperwork. We're needing to be involved as a signatory, both the the Riverfront Improvement Commission as well as the city, in 2011. And so that's what you see in your packet. From your approval this evening, the next council cycle, concluding with the 10th of July, the matter there'll be concurrent approval directing the mayor to sign the papers, essentially. So in this case, you'll see it's both Chairman Walton as well as the mayor, and then, of course, the other side of that. So city legal, Tom Warner in particular, has reviewed the documents prepared by Lane and Waterman. Doug Lindstrom prepared the documents for them, and then we received them. So if there are any questions, I can try to handle them, as well as Tim is here. No? So we'll just need your action, your approval on that.
Motion, call for a motion.
So moved.
Any further discussion, questions? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Same sign, opposed.
And then while we're talking about Lindsay Park Yacht Club, I promised I wouldn't drag Dan up here, but he wanted me to invite each of you to tonight from 7 to 8. The Great Lakes Navy Band is being hosted by the Lindsay Park Yacht Club outdoors at their venue. So if we wind up in time, they will be there, and there's a concert. Is it free? I didn't want to say free.
It's open to the public, and it has to be free for them to play. So
There you go. So,
so it's incentive to
so, and then a couple other fronts on that. I mentioned about the letter. Two other things in this very area, this outdoor area. If you all are familiar with the premises that's leased to Lindsay Park Yacht Club, there's a outdoor area that's sort of fenced in, and then to the west of the building, downstream, and then a parking lot. I met on site with Dan a couple weeks ago, and I don't think it requires any action because it's within their leased premises, but they would like to expand a little bit into their parking lot, about 25 to 30 feet, and then move at their cost the fencing accordingly to kind of provide for a little larger outdoor gathering space. Our only cost in this would be a little bit of restriping the parking lot, not the entirety, but there'll be a new thoroughfare needed, some arrows and some new parking and handicap parking, which we have done before, but this would necessitate. So, and then another update on the dredging. It's beginning in earnest. They've procured Superior out of Illinois City to do some dredging, and we've been working with Public Works to identify a location that everyone's happy with. I thank Zach for being involved in this as well. Veterans Memorial Park is it's been the traditional place, and it continues to be a good location for this, and it also saves Lindsay Park Yacht Club from having to pay dumping fees through the landfill.
at
Right.
a rate of like $72 a ton.
And there's
And further travel. So
right. So we're working out some of the details related to that, but we've been talking very, very often about these things. But I just wanted to update you on each of those things that I'm sure have been on your mind. So, are there any questions about that?
I was wondering if the Yacht Club had heard from Iowa DOT regarding to the construction and the possible problems.
Come up here.
congressional reps.
Well, but they can't hear you though. Like
Really?
otherwise.
Okay.
Yeah.
We heard back from Senator Grassley's rep and Senator Ernst rep was copied on it, that the DOT indeed denied any involvement or precipitating any of the increased turbidity. We did secure a report from the water plant, which is right there next to us, and other than this spring, like their turbidity levels on the raw water last year were really unchanged from previous years. This year's were considerably higher, but with the flood, I guess that does make some sense. So, but the information back from the federal DOT was they're denying any involvement of increasing our silt rate.
Okay, next item for discussion is the Canadian Pacific Railroad crossing.
Yeah, I guess I can. The task force that was assigned to look at joint issues with the city council that in our strategic plan actually is being used to some degree. Member change, the chair has joined the group on our side to meet with the public works staff to kind of go over the planning of the permanent crossings. And I think I've been at 2 meetings. There have been 3 meetings. The last meeting was just yesterday, and it ended, I think, with good direction. Our alderman here, Alderman Grip, kind of took over the meeting in terms of being able to be very specific on how on our agreement and consensus. And so I feel that there's direction that the public works staff has. That number of items are going to go back to the railroad for reply. And if we get a reply soon enough, we'll meet again next Monday. But I think the major issue was that some crossings to return it to a usable crossing for pedestrians, vehicles, and not damage the abutting properties. Some of them are very difficult. And there may need to be solutions that don't just include that crossing. And one we talked about in particular, and seems to be kind of the point of the spear to see what the railroad's willing to do, is the Gain Street crossing for John O'Donnell Stadium is rather difficult to get both pedestrians, traffic over that crossing and into the stadium without severely limiting who can go to the ballpark in terms of handicap accessibility. And the use of the parking lots that the city uses, both for the farmers market and for the Park and Recreation Department. So that is kind of the issue. Can Warren Street be opened up to be able to get to the other side of the tracks by cars, eliminating Gain Street as a vehicular access point? And so there's a lot of discussion on what that means. Do you have to give up another crossing? All of that is now kind of back to the railroad to make some determination. I think from what we hear from them will give us kind of an idea of what we do next. So I'm still very optimistic that with an overall look, working in small street by streets and then an overall step back look, we can figure out where we are when we come to the railroad and what they're willing to do. And then, how does that negotiation proceed and what happens, and how do we fit some of our flood problems, which damage, into like making some permanent repairs for us too. And I hope Steve will talk about that, especially for us. I think it's Harrison Street and Ripley Street. How will they return? How will Union Station be used? How can the back of Union Station be used? How do we access LeClaire Park? How does that parking lot for the freight house happen without losing an exit or entrance? And so I think those are still unknowns, and we're just going to have to work through some drawings to see what's possible.
Anybody else? Any comments?
Was there any update on the pedestrian status of close to River Heritage?
That park is probably the second, maybe it is the most difficult, in that there is no way to access it vehicularly. And how will that change? And their first initial concept was to move the access and try to bring it in with 3rd and 4th Street, which we heard from Public Works that their traffic engineer was not very keen on that kind of intersection. In my experience, DOT would not be either. There is some significant work that they would have to do. Zach, who's here, Peterson, the landscape architect, did show some drawings to us that maybe they could extend a flood wall they're interested in, which would allow us to have access then into the park as we have it now. And so by bringing the grade of the railroad down and then just extending what they want to do with flood walls, that too is in their court to respond what their intention is to do there, how they plan on protecting themselves as they go under the Arsenal Bridge. So we really don't know, but we do have the right questions in front of them. I think when we get those responses and the next time we meet, we'll know if we're going to be working on ideas or if we're going to stall out and wonder then what's the next step. That's helpful. But I think they know that the alternative that they proposed is not going to work, and really I don't think there has been any proposal that will work other than maybe lowering the tracks there and then using flood walls for them to protect their tracks.
Any other? Carl?
Is this on?
Carl?
Is that the on or is that the talk? Okay. So Dee, you're suggesting that the rails be lowered from the present elevation in order to ease the transition across across these rail crossings between the river and the river, between the River Drive side of the tracks and the river side of the tracks, that the tracks need to be lowered
It would
somewhat, if not totally.
Yeah, in this one area, and maybe Zach, why don't maybe you could explain it to the commission. I'm explaining your concept, so maybe if you could come up and just explain it. But this is just literally where the tracks begin to raise, which is upstream of the dam, so east of the dam, a very short distance, not the whole tracks coming down in the entire length,
So
just and this is
in
where
order
they
to-
start.
In order to restore access to River Heritage Park,
Right.
and then subsequently no change to the elevations.
We are not looking at changing the elevations of the track in this subgroup. We are looking on how we can build the streets back to work for both pedestrians and cars, and to mitigate any kind of ability to do our bigger planning that we've looked at for Main Street Landing and other places. I mean, we're really seriously looking at how to minimize what has happened and to take advantage of it where we can. And one of them is, the bike path. They proposed part of a bike path to be elevated because it would be difficult to bring it down, up and down every block. And so really having an elevated bike path to 21 would save maintenance for the city and for us quite a bit if that was already elevated. So there are some things that we're looking at that long term will be very helpful. And that's the way I think we're trying to approach every crossing.
Thanks for stalling. Zach Peterson, landscape architect, Public Works. So this is a snapshot taken from the PowerPoint that was given last night to the Joint Task Force. And this shows, and hopefully you can see what's going on there, maybe not so much for those in further back, but here's what's been proposed at the 30% level for the entrance to River Heritage Park. And it's basically a extension of the existing parking aisle all the way to 4th Street is what you see there. And with that, the extension of the bike path tying back in. Staff and the Joint Task Force doesn't support this proposal for the mentioned traffic impacts, as well as it really cuts into the master plan in terms of the great lawn feature that's supposed to be there. It's supposed to be an event lawn. It's supposed to be a place of gathering. I threw out, the point of, maybe the Bix post race would be a good use for this space in the future. But that being said, are there ways to, I was directed to look at ways to compromise, and then we'll be in discussion moving on from here as far as where to go.
So before you go, Zach, maybe just, I think it'd be helpful for those who haven't looked at that again.
Uh-huh.
Show them where you would go in now and what's there. So to the left.
This is the existing entrance.
And that's,
And right now it's at the flood elevation 21 that the rest of the tracks are, so it's not accessible. It would be a ridiculous slope to get up there in its current configuration and just won't work. So what's shown there is the extension at the outlet to 4th Street. So obviously we got some traffic challenges there with we don't have a controlled intersection there right now. It's just strictly traffic pulls off westbound onto 4th Street, and eastbound just waits turn to make that left-hand movement. So a lot of conflict points, not to mention the added conflict point of being right there with the railroad track in the mix. So it's from a staff perspective, it makes sense to keep it where it is, roughly mid-block between 4th and 3rd Street. So that's what you see there. So was that good? Did I answer your question? Okay.
I think that helps people who haven't, we've looked at it a couple of times.
Yeah. So here's what, just a take on a potential modification to what's shown there would keep the access point at more or less the same configuration. So if you can see the dots in the exhibit there, point number 1 is keep existing grade at entry or lower. The Canadian Pacific had mentioned that they felt the previous configuration of that intersection was still a little too high. But with this, we have an opportunity to actually lower it and better facilitate that entrance point. So what you see, if you can, in the profile down below, there's a red line that goes up really high. Right here, that's it's more or less the post elevation of the railroad track. So it goes up to that flood stage 21. And this point here is the entrance feature. So obviously it's up too high. What I've shown in black there, highlighted as 1, is to explore options to gradually increase the grade roughly to 1.5%. And when you do that out further, it's going to take longer to hit that proposed grade further on to the east, but that will allow in such an operation to continue the proposed flood wall, or what are we calling this, viaduct? The term for it?
Called it a trench.
Trench, Marinara Trench. Okay, so basically what this would call for is an extension of that to hit that grade, and in a flood event it would require, what I'm showing in point number 3 there is construct gates at the park entrance that can be sealed off in a flood event. And another benefit of that has to do with the way floods behave in this circumstance. This is kind of the key image, which shows the condition at flood stage 19. And what happens in the park is the park doesn't necessarily flood on its own. It fills up through the storm sewers and back into the park. So that's one of those naturally occurring in-site occurrences. So if we were to extend that wall and have mountable panels, we could theoretically keep the park dry during the floods between where it's affected 18 up to, was it 22 where it starts coming over the wall? Okay. 22? Okay, so 22 where it comes over the wall, but we'd be protected up to that height. So these are items we want to discuss further with the railroad, and hopefully we can come to an agreement that will not compromise the master planning that's been done thus far.
How high is the river elevation when the water comes up from the manholes in the middle of the street on River Drive?
I'm showing flood stage 19 there, so a little bit before then, 18 to, and then if you look at 20, it's still, that's where it's really coming up through the backwards migration of the water. So around that kind of a flood event.
It's the elevation of the water downstream of the dam.
Comes backwards on them from the west to east and then up the storm. The storm sewers are lower.
Thank you very much, Zach,
Sure.
and I appreciate the tremendous effort you've made. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I got to tell you, I don't find any of this acceptable. I've attended two of the remodeled group that started out as a planning group and turned into an engineering group, and I've traveled up and down the river. You know, everything I ever needed to know I learned in kindergarten. And the first thing I learned was when you make a mess, you should clean it up. And the railroad has made a tremendous mess. And I think the railroad owes it to the city of Davenport to clean it up, not help us do triage or put bandages on the scars and that they have created on our riverfront. This mad dash for a permanent solution to what we all know is a temporary problem that has visited us once in 26 years and may very well be added to by the method of application of the HESCO barriers in the East End. I think that the commission should take the position that the railroad owes it to the city to restore the riverfront to its original condition. And I think anything less than that, it defaults to the railroad's rather imperious behavior of severing us from our riverfront, our most significant asset in our community. You know, we've been working on this for decades, and to just have it literally torn from our grasp as it is now is completely unacceptable. And I think the commission should go on record saying that we are opposed to anything other than the restoration of the riverfront to the condition that it was in prior to the railroad raising its tracks. Now, after that, I think the city, through its commission or through what yet another ad hoc body may be appointed, should enter into discussions with the railroad to alleviate their concerns for flooding protection. If that means reinforcing the bike path at its original elevation so that the HESCO barriers can be placed on the river side of the railroad tracks in order to protect the railroad during high flood, that's certainly something that deserves to be explored. But to, you know, I just simply fail to grasp why the city is raising the white flag of surrender so very early in this dialogue. And I think it's up to our commission then to stand up for Davenport if others won't.
Kelly, you next.
Yeah, actually, I was going to comment, just add on to Dee's comment about sort of reporting out. Just that one of the things that we had talked about, I think somewhat significantly, on the question of closing crossings, having to swap a crossing, that in addition to the fact that we were going back from the perspective that we don't want to have any closings, any of the crossings closed. We don't want to do a swap. But in the event that we were going to look at that, that we would want to look outside of the downtown Riverfront area where most of the work that we're doing would be compromised. And so I think I just wanted to add on to Dee's report, just that is something I think would come back to us to have some serious conversation about if we had to swap a closing, what would be on the breadth of the riverfront, what would be the least impactful place where we would give up a crossing if we had to give it. Now that's different than and so this is
That's
this is a
fine.
completely
I mean,
separate
we're just
thing.
in open comment
Yeah, I'm not sure that
moment.
I don't know if this whole call thing, maybe that's a conversation that doesn't seem like it's a very effective way, because I feel like this is sort of out of order with your comments now. But I just think that's something we should be thinking about in the event that we do have to have a conversation about, okay, if you really want to keep all of the existing crossings in the downtown area and you would have to give up one as a commission, where I think our feedback on what would be the least impactful crossing to give up would be really important and something we should be thinking about, separate from what you're talking about, Carl.
Thank you,
You never
Zach.
know.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I'll make a motion that the that the Riverfront Improvement Commission requests that the railroad restore the rail bed to its original elevation, and that they subsequently enter into dialogue with the railroad to enhance the railroad's flood protection.
Is there a second? I
Well,
guess
thanks,
that-
fellas.
I guess that motion failed, Carl.
So, Carl, I think to your point, it's worth us having a better understanding of legally why we maybe don't have the ability to do that. I don't know that we feel like we necessarily have a strong legal opinion anybody's provided to us in terms of the Surface Transportation Board, which seems to really govern this issue. I think the commission needs to have a copy of a legal opinion with regard to that to be able to determine what is the appropriate stand to take. So that would be my preference, is that we obtain from, whether it's the city attorney or if we think, maybe we need to, go further afield for an opinion to really understand what are the legal rights of the city of Davenport with regard to interacting with the railroad and their raising of the tracks. If in fact the Surface Transportation Board governs this and they would say, look, you don't have the opportunity to have the tracks lowered. If the railroad has the right to do that, we should know that and then proceed based on that. So I think getting a proper legal opinion would be beneficial for the commission, and I would certainly be in favor of that.
Yeah, I guess where I'm at is that, I've read what Tom Werner has given to the city council. I understand that the operation of the railroad is clearly not in the hands of the state, it's the hands of the federal government. There are some exceptions with crossings. Everything I read in all those opinions, however, Carl, did not talk about off of the railroad right-of-way. So if we're not talking about when the trains go, what time the trains go, how long they stop, how high the crossing is, if we're now talking about the use of the property because of the crossing has been damaged, I don't think we've looked at that issue. I think we're kind of holding on that issue because maybe they can make us whole. I think that's our number one desire, is that we have these riverfront plans. If you look at the one that RDG has done, they actually raise the ground in most of these locations to get most everything out of a 21-foot flood. And so, what can we do with the elevation of the railroad track? I think that, and I now feel a little uncomfortable that the committee that was working on other issues got kind of hijacked, because it could be maybe other people on this commission who would want a voice in those meetings. But I think that we should work with the railroad till we know what we really have from them. I think that I'd like to see cooperation and some coming to the table, because again, I believe that they've damaged us and we need to be made whole like you do. Not does that mean necessarily that the tracks have to come down. Being made whole can be done in different ways. And I think we just got to figure out if, I've got to wait and see if we come to that conclusion. We may not. But, when you feel damaged, then there's damages, and you can assess damages and you can assess value to damages. And I think that's where I'm sitting as I watch everything happen.
Ryan? Kyle Grip? Kyle, are you up? Is that your number?
That's Ryan.
Well, Ryan's here, but Kyle was there. Your light was on? Yeah, I have a comment. Okay, Kyle.
Whatever order. So I just kind of wanted to tell you after our last meeting, when I went to the city council, and kind of my suggestion was, hey, I think we have two options here, and the city council needs to make a decision. The first option is kind of what Carl said, which is we pushed the issue with the railroad, and we tried to enter into some sort of legal engagement with them to take the tracks back to where they were before they raised them. I hope you all know that we asked the railroad flat out, will you lower the tracks back? And they answered flat out, no, we will not. 21 feet is where we're going to keep these tracks. Okay, so then we asked Tom for legal opinion, and then we wanted to see some case law that would give us some idea of what our chances are. Because if we're going to enter into legal action, we need to know how much it's going to cost, about how long it's going to take, and what our chances of winning are. So Tom came back. He is not a railroad lawyer. He is our city attorney. But he came back and he said, from what he can see from case law that he has read about, is that the governing body is the Federal Surface Transportation Board. If you take this to a court will kick it out and say this is the jurisdiction of this transportation board. So they're the regulatory body of whether this can happen or not. He did find a couple of cases. One of them I think is the most relevant is the city of Sabri they had a law on their books, the city did, where the railroad could not raise the tracks without city council approval. And they also had an agreement from 40 years earlier between the previous owner of the tracks and the city, saying that they wouldn't raise the tracks without the city's agreement. The railroad raised the tracks. The city went into this engagement with the railroad, and they lost. It was sent to the transportation board, and the transportation board says, no, this is within their rights to do to keep the trains running. I think that's probably the most relevant case law that's out there. So I threw that to the city council, and I said, we need to make a decision. Do we want to go down this path with the transportation board, or do we want to continue looking at the crossings and in negotiations with the railroad? I did not hear anybody who said they wanted to take the legal route. So the already agreed upon course of action was to continue to look at the intersections individually with that task force. So that's what we have continued to do. We also think that we have a willing partner. If at some point Canadian Pacific ceases to be a willing partner, then we may have a different decision point, which is what I think Dee was saying earlier.
As many of you know, I am an attorney in the state of Illinois. I'm not licensed in the state of Iowa. I've done my own research as a commissioner. I have not seen anything in the city attorney's positions that I disagree with, that I think are inaccurate. Quite frankly, Canadian Pacific, as Alderman Grip said, does not have to work with us. They could go and build these crossings on their own in 30 days and walk away. I think it's important, because they are working with us, that we continue to build that relationship and not take a position that we just demand that they lower the railroad tracks back to the normal grade. I think it's important that we don't take that position because we as commissioners on this group need to be at the table and helping as part of those conversations, not simply stating the same opinion that we want them to do something that they're not going to do, and that even if we did challenge at the STB, we most likely would lose.
Bill?
I think we should remember there is another answer, and that answer is one in which the railroad lowers their track a little bit, and we do other things. They don't have to bring the track all the way back up. We could accept some other elevation, and they could accept some other elevation, and we build a little bit of flood protection and some removable flood protection that gives them protection to the, whatever frequency they want. Right now, they came in with one number, and they want that, and it jeopardizes a lot of things that we've done, spent a lot of money doing, and we can sit down at the table with the person and negotiate what's going to be the final solution. We want to make sure we're at that table.
Yeah, I think I certainly don't have the expertise to give you the details as to how this can work. And talking with Dee a little bit, she explained to me one of the issues. But at least in theory, the railroad did this because they want to have their tracks and be able to move their merchandise during floods. So they need flood protection. We as a city need flood protection. So we have a common goal. So working together with them and perhaps build some kind of flood protection so that we both can be happy seems like a reasonable thing to to talk about. And if it means putting something on the riverside of the railroad tracks to help protect their endeavor and still protect the city, if that's at all possible, it seems to me that's a very logical avenue that we should be pursuing. And I realize there are hurdles and obstacles to make that all happen, but nonetheless, at least in theory, it seems to me a no-brainer that working with the Canadian Pacific people to try to provide protection for both them and us is a reasonable avenue to pursue.
Carl, I think the majority of us agree with you. I mean, we're upset. But I think from what everybody's said, I think we want to wait maybe to our next meeting to make some sort of motion about Canadian Pacific to see how much progress we've made. And so we'll have it on the agenda for the next meeting again, obviously.
Well, I certainly thank you all for your comments and wisdom. I'll reserve the option to renew my motion at a subsequent time.
Steve, I think done with that discussion. Strategic planning.
I think joint work group.
Do you have any comments yourself? You haven't made any comments. You want to?
No, I just
summarize.
Feverishly was trying to capture everything as I have been in these meetings and trying to send that back out to the group so that we're capturing all the comments. I think item C is kind of a redundant point, and so if you don't mind, I would like to provide a bit of a staff report at this time, and then Richard will follow me. So a couple items. I think some good news, additional good news related to Union Station is the 3 tenants in the second floor. We should be able to get them back in the building, excuse me, next week, first of the month. We have, as I reported at last month's meeting, we got in with Warner Restoration right away after the building took on water, and Chairman, you've been inside, and some others might have as well, but it is about a midpoint where it is dried out and a lot of the furniture and contents and all of that have been saved. Certainly the hygienist has released it and it's safe, and we're now at a point where the upper level tenants are able to be back in there. And so I've communicated that with them. There should be no issue with the second part of this, the restoration phase, when we need to go and put up the drywall, some painting, and some further completion of that main level floor. I've also been in touch with the eventual first floor tenant. That agreement has been delayed a little bit, but Visit Quad Cities is still interested in being our tenant on the main level. And so we're working obviously with them as well, so that we don't do anything that has to be undone in this build out. But the idea is that I probably overstate the word build out. It's more of a restoration in order for them to get in there probably later this fall. We do have some items such as the sump pumps that are in the building are going to be replaced, and some really important things that are going to be updated, and as a result of the flooding. So that's all occurring. That's on the inside. On the outside, we have out on the street a request for proposals for an A&E, or an architectural engineering firm, for design plans to look at specifically the south side. This is where, if you're familiar at all with this area, it's bricked area. This stretch goes from Harrison to Ripley, from essentially a curb along the easement of the tracks north to and including sort of the open-aired, what we call patio, between the two buildings, Union Station and the Package Express building. The blowout, as I'll call it, the cave-in from which was beneath the HESCOs, was just a couple feet away from the entrance, the ramp deck area of the Package Express building. And you can see that if you're on site. And of course, it also has a beveled area that extends several yards to the east from this area as well. So what happened is the pressure provided a water inundation from beneath the HESCOs, and it just overcame it from beneath and filled up behind, which was a barrier. The HESCO was a barrier between that and the wall. So the idea here is to look at a way to ensure that was the first flooding event this year. The second one that we had, we went back to the plan and made sure that the plates were up on the doors, and the HESCO went up, but the HESCO had to go more interior than it had before, because the brick, there was fear, I'll put it this way, there was less confidence, very low confidence that any of the brick in that surrounding larger contextual area would hold the heavy HESCOs once again. And so that, in your mind, moving forward, and with this RFP, what it's seeking is to identify a way in which we have a flood project that will essentially be able to house the HESCOs with a safe surface. I kind of refer to it in my head as a bit of a yellow brick road. We use the sidewalk on the north side of the building, and we need to extend it to a point where then the HESCOs follow it, and same on the south side. It encircles an area, and we need that strong foundation upon which to set the HESCOs. And what you do beyond that, I think, is something for larger discussion with this eventual firm selected, because you could look at some landscaping area and kind of prettify or beautify that area to the south, and allow the sidewalk that the HESCOs could be used, and you could cut off. You may not need the parking spaces on the south side. You might even be able to get away with closing off it's essentially a drive-through. It's a little bit dangerous sometimes, and if you've been there, aside from the flooding, there's a topography, rolling nature to the south side that pools water constantly because of its age and the bricks and all of that. So you could look at that. You could possibly, depending on if there's enough room to put the HESCOs, you could keep open. I think that remains to be seen at this point, but as Dee pointed out at our meeting yesterday, very important to look at this in context with the larger Canadian Pacific crossing discussion, both from a Harrison to Ripley and Beiderbecke area, this whole thing being looked at, not just pieces. So I wanted to provide that update to you that is underway, and hopefully we'll be able to, resolve that, in a way that primarily answers the question with high confidence of the HESCO placement, and then secondarily makes it a much more beautified area to the south as well. Both those things can be accomplished here.
I have a,
Yeah, Steve, are you saying that's underway, meaning? Oh, I'm sorry.
I want to make sure I got it straight. We had one crest. The plan that Public Works has for flood-proofing the building was not used, and it got flooded. And then the water come up again, and the second time they used the plan, and it worked. So my question is, how much damage was done when the first plan wasn't used and it got flooded? Do you have any idea what the cost is?
I don't offhand.
Because I don't want to pick a fight, but it seems to me like the commission shouldn't be paying for that. They didn't use the plan that they're supposed to use, so they're at fault.
Well,
That's how.
and
Go ahead.
you're not in the way that the cost is being borne from. I mean, the city has done the cleanup and the restoration. The commission's not being charged with that. So if that's what you're asking.
So my question is just that back area, and what is, I'm thinking that's also used for vendor access and the ability to get in and deliver. Is it used for anything beyond just parking right now? I mean,
So we're at Union Station, so there's not vendor access. I mean, that's more freight house. So there's really tenants.
Well, I guess I'm thinking like Taste of Ethiopia. Will they need to have vendors to have access to come in the back way for deliveries for anything, or is that not the
talked
case?
to them. I mean, I think having that as it is preferred, but it certainly is. There's lots of parking, both to the north as well as all the other directions, actually, east and west. There's lots of parking, but very specifically having, I think the biggest thing would be to have through signage and sidewalk, specifically from the north, because their entrance is only to the south anyway. Both of their entrances for this restaurant, there's not a north entrance. That was a decision that they made, too. But as far as vendor, wheeling in, it's a matter of feet difference.
Okay,
So
and
yes,
so-
inconveniences, perhaps. Have some people parked or been used to parking on the south side, tenants in the building? Certainly. But is there adjacent parking still available, even if you remove some, on the south side? Yes.
Okay, so we don't need, for planning purposes, that's what I'm really trying to sort of wrap my head around. We don't need it for places for garbage or any other purpose. It's not something that you don't feel is something that's necessary for us to have an inviting location and space for future tenants.
Yeah, I think we're not picking against, I don't want to parse your
Okay.
words here, but I think we can still come up with an eventual plan that is still inviting. I think the one possible inconvenience is some of that parking being removed. And then the second part is we have a dumpster right in that area. We just built we had a CIP project that put an enclosure there. If we were to close access, this is something to consider, but close access inward from Ripley Street, we would have to turn that and orient it differently, turn it about 180 degrees and access it from Ripley Street.
Okay, yeah, and so that's my main concern, is just to make sure that we have those things on our radar that still keep us as an attractive location for future tenants. Even if our current ones have figured out a way to maneuver it, that we don't put ourselves in a situation where down the road, we have to reconfigure something to be able to lure tenants there. So
And you have an excellent point. Mind is on that. The truth of the matter is the terrain is dangerous as it is. I mean, it is partial concrete, partial brick, very beveled, very uneven. I mean, we're not starting from perfection.
Okay.
And so
not really
improvement-
being used that much to begin with.
well,
for,
I mean, from a parking standpoint, for
Okay.
some of the tenants, certainly. And I've had some preliminary discussion, not going too far out, just wanting to have some preliminary conversations. I don't know what the eventual outcome will be. I heard the beginning of a question here. It's just very early. It's just selecting a firm, and then the product will come, But and that's through some dialogue and some back and forth, obviously. Some pros and cons to every scenario, potentially.
Thank you.
Bill, you done?
Well, I was just going to ask if this is a proposed project, or is this something you said it's underway, and
It
that
is-
kind of got my attention. It's
is
already,
underway. To
already
select a
moving
firm.
forward. I didn't know what was the deal there. But obviously, I think if I understand this correctly, you're just talking about basically that brick area around Union Station and the Package Express area is brick now and is very wavy. And
All on the south side, though.
yes, and you're talking about smoothing that out, so it's basically not only easier for pedestrians or vehicles or whatever, it's going to be around that facility.
That's a
to-
scenario. It could also be where it's closed off. Another scenario where it's landscaped and that you'd have a sidewalk that
And
connects
you also
the
want an
pedestrian.
area where the HESCO barriers have a
And
good
where the-
foundation.
where
So
the
it's a
HESCOs would
combination
receive-
of a couple things.
I want to point out that it's not a beautification project. That primarily is the issue that we all should be concerned about, is that the HESCOs have a solid surface upon which to be sat or placed. And then everything else should run secondary to that, in my judgment. And so, especially in light of the fact that this could be a candidate for a federal program, for dollars for some funding. That primarily is the purpose behind any such program.
Yeah, I would love to see the scope of services that you may be looking at. So maybe the whole commission could get a hold of those if you have those yet. My thought is, as we talk about the brick, even though the brick may have had some issues prior to the flood, I'm sure that this flood and many others have caused this to happen, because I remember when the brick were flat. So I don't know if you've had someone to come to the city and do a repair by repair review of what they would fund and not fund. Are you to that point with projects? I would suggest that you show them the entire backside of Union Station and see what they're willing to use as damage.
Mm-hmm.
And that then will help us figure out the further scope of what we can do. The other thing is that I've noticed with the temporary on Harrison, because we have the temporary going over, there's a lot of, because the storm sewer is missing now, there's a lot of flooding, there's a lot of water that has holes and ponds, and it takes a few days. So there's a stormwater thing. City staff and this architect that you're selecting have to work hand in hand. So we got to get city staff as in Public Works to be right there with them in that. And then I think the other thing that we should look at is you when you look out, there's a raised curb about 8 inches, and then there was probably just dirt, but now it's just like everything is run over it. What surface could that be? What could that be? So I, in the scope of services, I would like them to look from the railroad track this way. And then this is a place where a decorative fence that is an architecturally decorative fence eventually would be wonderful, and it would only be the height of the railroad track. And then you would have this part coming forward that you could do a number of things with. I just think there's an unbelievable opportunity, and I'm with you. We want the surface of the new road, even if it's a four-car parking lot or whatever, to be made of materials and a bed that it is not going to bend up and move around. It needs that now. I think that building deserves it. We have the right tenants. We have people who are going to, the Convention Bureau and the pickers, if they come, they're going to want to use both sides. We really need that side to work. And I think we can do that in a what I would call a repair mitigation project.
Anything else on that? Otherwise, I can move on to another couple items. Okay. In your packet, there's I've revised it, I think, 3 different times, but we are off to the races with a revised summer concert series schedule, and so we were able to postpone a couple, cancel a couple others, but essentially we kick off July 3rd with Red, White, and Boom. We're placing that concert at the Freight House because that is a Wednesday evening and the Freight House will be alive as well. But truly at the band shell, we believe we'll be able to utilize the band shell in the adjacent seating area for our first concert of the season on July 14th, as you will see in the schedule. And that happens to be a Bix preview night where there'll be 3 different bands, and that starts at 6 p.m. So if anyone's interested or listening at home or whatever, the website has been updated to reflect this revised schedule. The other item is, as of today, we were able to do a couple repairs around the Channel Cat dock area, some minor things but flood related, and some cleanup along the walkway. And so that opened today. That dock was ready for stops, and Channel Cat operations will include it. As for Marquette, this week, by week's end, we will have those sort of reinstalled. The water level is at a level, I think, where you say this, I shouldn't. I don't want to say it publicly. It shouldn't go up from here, but I think we're in a safe place from all indications to be able to take the Marquette, have the Marquette boat docks reinstalled. I want to make mention of 2 things related to that. We received grant funding for kayak launch points, one for Marquette as well as one for South Concord or Busey Landing. We have to get to under 10 feet at Busey before we can even reinstall. So that remains to be seen whether that will even, those boat docks and that kayak launch will happen this year. We'll just wait and see. But what will happen is at Marquette, once installed, we will install this new kayak launch point. We received RDA funding for in the fall. Additionally, we have some handrails that the Quad City Inn Fishermen Club has offered to sponsor a cost share basically for a couple 6 or so handrails. So the idea is to assist boaters that need sort of a lift out of the boat dock or out of the boat onto the boat dock. And so these are strategically placed along the boat dock sections. And so we have those, and those will be installed as the boat docks themselves are installed here in short order. Another item, July meeting next month on the 23rd, that our yearly election of officers. So I just wanted to give you, that'll be on the agenda. So that's, you all can handle that, but I wanted to make mention of that. And then we have done, there's 2 things related to the whole tenant engagement that we've been working on throughout this whole process, this flood process. We have tried to garner up as much media attention, and now I'm talking specifically in and around the Freight House for those businesses. And so just last Friday, I sent out a note to you all. There was, the exciting part about after 98 days reopening River Drive. We were able to stage that. I sort of inserted myself into this, and we, on your behalf and on the tenants' behalf, and we staged it at the Freight House, and we had businesses that were able to talk about the impact that they've had and the excitement about sort of returning back to some level of normalcy and how important that is for their businesses. And so we've worked really diligently on that, along with having events. And in fact, we're scheduling one. There'll be several this year, but I think one of note will be on Sunday, August 4th, where we're wanting to host, live music and sort of have specials with these businesses and try to really drum up the public to, not forget about the Freight House as a destination place. And so it doesn't automatically and all by itself just go back to normal. And I want you to know on your behalf that we have been working very diligently and closely with all of our tenants, but specifically, at the Freight House in that general area and Union Station particularly, knowing the kind of destination area that it represents. And so they're all very appreciative, and we continue to fight the fight here. So, are there any questions on any of that?
Yeah, Steve, can you just real briefly elaborate how the kayak launch site is different than the I assume it's where the boat ramp is now at Marquette Street, but
Yeah.
what's different?
Yeah, so we actually have we have an upstream, we have parallel upstream and downstream sections, so there's like 4 or 5 on the upstream side, maybe 6 or so. Through this grant on the downstream side, we were able to provide an additional boat dock section because actually when water goes down to a level like it should in August usually, they were coming up out of the water. They were running out of room to actually boat in, without hitting the ramp. And so we were able to purchase another boat dock section. But we also know through events, of Floatzilla and many other, that people love to launch, and we need more launch points. And so we were tickled to get a grant that would place on the upstream side at Marquette at the Riverside boat section one of these drive up launch points. And so you basically just paddle right up to it. You go right into it, and it's connected to the existing boat dock section. And so it's attached to it, but it makes it very convenient and easy. It stays in there. People, I think, will appreciate that addition. Good.
At our meeting, at the first part of May, we had the Friends of Vanderveer and the Friends of Credit Island come, or I should say just the officers, give us a brief, what are you guys doing? What's your plans, And it's a real, between those two groups, there's a real, I hate to say bipolar, but there's a real difference, Vanderveer is more of a fundraiser type group and program type group, which is great. Don't get, and Credit Island is more the let's go in and dig something up and fix something type of group, hands on, Bob Peppers was the one talking, and if you know Bob, I want to get in there and do something, But they both do good work. They're both good, we appreciate all their help. That was mainly our meeting, and now with this flood, Credit Island, who knows? If you haven't been down there, the road is, have you seen the road, Bill? The road is gone. The water came underneath the asphalt. If you can lift up those chunks of asphalt, the water just lifted them up, and so that was it. That's just I know we're running late, so that's just a brief overview here.
So now's the time to remove the causeway, open the channel, and let Mother Nature do what it does best. Or if you're and build a bridge, then make Credit Island an island. Alternatively, put 10 or 15 or 20 6-foot culverts and put your asphalt road over the top of that and let the water clean out the lagoon and take it all downstream as nature intended. All that silt in that lagoon arises from the fact that that causeway is in existence.
Yeah, I mean,
You know it as well as I do, sir. Yeah.
I think it was, 18 months ago, an engineer from Davenport gave me a letter about this. I think he's sitting right there. We we discussed this, and he gave us his opinion. And I don't know, money. You know the. But I agree, it would help. But
I
it's
got
like,
Bob Peppers on an end loader waiting to go to work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They one of their projects, they want to lift that tank up about 4 feet. What tank? The tank. The famous.
I got a place for you to put that tank. Move the tank to Veterans Memorial Park.
Oh no. I'm not touching that one. I'm not touching that. No. But I know what you're thinking, Mr. Churchill, and I'm not going to comment on that. But anyway, is there any other questions? We all want to get out of here. So.
Thank you, Richard.
All right, guys. Oh, how much of that dredge material, and where are they going to put that in Veterans Park? Any idea?
I'm trying to describe the area, but
Oh,
in an area that is where it'll be convenient for dumping and has traditionally been past practice. I don't know how else to describe it without showing you on a map.
yeah. I mean, is it in the future plans to raise that anyway?
The spoils are needed there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, and this will be trucked, not barge, right?
Correct.
Okay, just curious.
Bill?
Yeah, as a member of the Friends of Veterans Memorial Park, actually raising that and having that is not a bad idea. That's actually a good thing because as we've had these major floods, I've been watching the 3 flagpoles in the Veterans Memorial Park and the little concrete area, and I even walked all the way up to the middle of Centennial Bridge to see if I could see if it did in fact stay above water, and it did. Even in our highest flood, the 3 flagpoles did not go under. So adding a little dirt, and remember, there's 43 acres to this Veterans Memorial Park. It's not just where the 3 flagpoles are. So you're talking a pretty large area that has a lot of area that could dump some dirt would be no problem. In fact, we're glad to get it.
Public with comment? Seeing none. Motion to adjourn? Second. All in favor, say aye. We're adjourned.